This week I did something very dumb as a parent. My daughter Daisy has this like blanket type thing that is like a mermaid tail. It's like a sleeping bag kind of thing that she can get into because of the many princesses that she's in love with right now. Ariel is right there. Maybe not right at the top right now. I bet by this summer she will be again. It's Elsa right now because it's cold. Yeah. But anyway, she was telling me this story about how she got in her mermaid tail and slid down the stairs. And she was just so excited that she had done this. She had the time of her life, and she wanted me to like be a part of that and celebrate that with her and be like, that's so cool. And instead, what I did, without even thinking, just my gut reaction to her was, oh gosh, you should not do that because you could break your tailbone. And she looked at me and her eyes got super wide and they started welling up with tears. And she said, I didn't even know I had a tailbone. I don't want to break it. And so I was like, I don't know why I thought this would be better. I pulled up pictures on my phone, like, here's what a tailbone looks like. And then she was like, what does it look like when it's broken? And I was like, I don't know. It doesn't feel good, but there's this thing where my first reaction to pretty much anything is like my brain always goes to, here's what could go wrong with that, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but if that's my default all the time, it's not a great place to live. It's certainly not a great place to live if that's just my reactive stance to where I'm just saying that kind of stuff to my daughter who's just trying to have a great time. Now, it is true, if you slide down the stairs, you might break your tailbone, but she didn't need to know that at that time. This is just something that's like ingrained into me to the point where some friends that I used to work with on a regular basis, they started calling me Shooter McGavin because they said that I would just shoot down any idea that they had. They did not like being in meetings with me. I thought everyone thought that I was a very creative person. It turns out they're like, all you do is tell us how everything is going to not work. I don't like this about myself. I find it far more natural to react in fear than to respond with hope, which obviously is what I want to talk about tonight, this idea of fear versus hope. And to do that, we're going to be looking at another very famous story of something that Jesus does in the book of Luke. So it's a very short story, but a very famous one of Jesus healing a woman. And we're just going to jump right into it. But to give you a little bit of backstory, up until this point in the chapter that we're in Luke, Jesus has been kind of traveling around doing all sorts of amazing things. He just gets back into town, and word has spread about him, so there's a huge crowd gathering around him. And it says that the crowd was rushing to him so strongly that the crowds almost crush him. So you have to imagine just like chaos and a huge crowd around Jesus. That's where we pick up this story. This is Luke 8, we're starting in verse 43. In the crowd that day, there was a woman who for 12 years had been afflicted with hemorrhages. She had spent every penny she had on doctors, but not one had been able to help her. We're going to stop there for a second. There is so much that is said in these two sentences. Just a couple of words convey just tons of what's going on here. So this woman, for reasons that are not clear, has been bleeding for 12 years, like it says. In Jewish culture, that would make her ceremonially unclean, which means that she couldn't interact with any of the religious things that went on in their society, which were ingrained into every bit of their society. So this woman has basically been excluded and ostracized from her community because she cannot stop bleeding. And if she's unclean, she has to be kept away from everyone else. So she's gone 12 years of trying to find answers to this, 12 years of trying to get healthy, 12 years of seeing people who could hopefully help her heal, only to be told again, like, there's nothing else we can do for you. 12 years without the love or support of the people that she needs the most. And so when we find her in this story, she has spent 12 years of hitting this point of despair that I imagine saying, like, what am I supposed to do now? Like with each person telling her, like, we've reached the end of what I know to do for you. There's nothing I can do. Like, what am I supposed to do now? And those are moments that we have all experienced. Like when we get a bad diagnosis, or when when a job falls through, when we lose people who are close to us, or when the person that we love the most decides that they're done. In those crushing moments, we find ourselves asking, what am I supposed to do now? We're at a crossroads of choosing between leaning into fear or leaning into hope. We're going to set aside that story for just a second. I know we just got into the first couple sentences of it, but there's an incredible example of choosing hope over fear in the darkest situations in the book of Lamentations. And it's one that always strikes me, and it's something that I forget about a lot, but every time I read it, I'm like, oh my gosh, yes, I forgot about how good this is. The book of Lamentations is 5 different poems, essentially, written about or in the context of Jerusalem being conquered and being razed to the ground, and the people that did survive being sent off into exile. So kind of the worst thing that you can imagine happening to your family and your community happening. It is written in the context of that. I'm going to read just a couple different excerpts of Lamentations 3. I'm going to start in verse 19. Just listen. It'll be up on the screen, but just listen. I feel like this conveys what this woman would have been feeling. I'll never forget the trouble, the utter lostness, the taste of ashes, the poison I've swallowed. I remember it all. Oh, how well I remember. The feeling of hitting the bottom. But there's one other thing I remember. And remembering, I keep a grip on hope. Because of God's great love, we are not consumed. For his compassions never fail. They're created new every morning. How great is your faithfulness. I'm sticking with God. I say it over and over. He's all I got left. God proves to be good to the man who passionately waits, to the woman who diligently seeks. It's a good thing to quietly hope for help from God. It's a good thing when you're young to stick it out through the hard times. When life is heavy and hard to take, go off by yourself, enter the silence, bow in prayer, wait for hope to appear. Don't run from trouble, take it full face. The worst is never the worst. The tears stream from my eyes, an artisan well of tears, until you, God, look down from on high. Look and see my tears. I called out your name, O God, called from the bottom of the pit, and you listened when I called out. God, don't shut your ears. Get me out of here. Save me. You came close when I called out, and you said, do not be afraid. The writer of this poem is going through utter ruin. And yet what they want to convey to us is waiting for hope to appear. That idea of waiting for hope to appear means you are actively looking for signs of hope. And when it does, do not be afraid. The woman in the story has spent 12 years waiting for hope to appear. And in Jesus, she sees that hope. And that hope is what drove her to her audacious act. Picking back up in the story, she slipped in from behind and touched the edge of Jesus' robe. And at that very moment, her hemorrhaging stopped. Again, just one sentence, but this is an incredibly risky move for this woman to do. Again, this is a huge crowd. She would have had to push her way through to get up to Jesus, which means she is physically touching so many different people, which means according to their laws, she's contaminating or making every single person that she touches unclean as she pushes past them. What if she doesn't get to Jesus? Worse, what if she does and it doesn't work? What if someone recognizes her in the crowd and then the crowd turns on her? These are all the things that I would probably automatically say to her if she were asking me what she thinks I should do. Here's everything that could go wrong. She doesn't let any of those fears stop her. You see, fear conveys to us what bad could happen. Fear produces timidity, an apprehensiveness, a reactiveness. Here's all the reasons why you shouldn't. Hope tells us what good could happen. Hope produces courage. It produces a responsiveness rather than a reactiveness. Here's all the reasons you should or could do something. It doesn't mean you aren't afraid, but it means that you don't let fear control you. Hope produces a courage that lets you push through fear. It doesn't negate the fear. It overcomes it. This woman's hope has given her so much courage that no fear that she had, which she probably had more fears than even I just listed off there, none of those stood any chance of stopping her. The story continues. Jesus said, "Who touched me?" Which is a hilarious question to ask when you're surrounded by a crowd of people almost crushing you. And when no one stepped forward, Peter said, "But Master, we've got crowds of people on our hands. Dozens of people have touched you. What on earth are you asking?" Jesus insisted, "Someone touched me. I felt power discharging from me." When the woman realized that she couldn't remain hidden, she knelt trembling before him. In front of all the people, she blurted out her story, why she touched him, and how at the same moment she was healed. And Jesus said, "Daughter, you took a risk trusting me. Your faith has healed you. Go in peace." Now, the point of this woman's story is not that if we just have enough faith, we'll be healed, okay? I think the point is that God is in the business of making all things new. God is in the business of working to bring out good from every situation. Paul writes in Romans 8 that God is working all things together for good. Even the most utter ruin that we can experience, God wants to bring good out of that if we're willing to look for it and respond to it. This woman's story reminds me that in any and every situation, even in utter ruin, wait for hope to appear and do not be afraid. We've been talking about how do we take that next step into what God is calling us. And in many ways, these are often going to be small things that we're doing. Small things stacked over time that lead to a bigger change. So my question for tonight is, how do we shift away from fear? How do we shift more towards hope? Because it's one thing to talk about these things, but how do we actually do that? Especially for someone like me, where the fear is just so ingrained into how my brain processes information. And I don't think I'm necessarily unique in that regard. How do I shift away from always reacting with all the things that could possibly go wrong? How do we wait for hope to appear? I don't know if you caught it in Lamentations. It says something about it is good for the man to passionately wait. That's such an interesting idea. Passionately waiting. How do we do that? I think, again, it's little things. I think perhaps training ourselves to respond to situations by being curious and wondering what could go right. I think it's being curious and looking for where God's shalom is breaking through. The last thing Jesus says to this woman is go in peace. That idea of peace, of shalom, is, we've talked about this a lot, it is not the idea of the absence of violence. It is the idea of wholeness and completeness. God has just healed her physically, yes, but so much more, restored her psychologically and relationally. Go in wholeness, he says to her. Her hope let her see what God wanted to do and step into a situation that brought more wholeness into the world. We can begin being curious and looking for where God's shalom is breaking through. What goodness, what wholeness is God wanting to bring out of whatever situation we find ourselves in? Those are hard questions to ask sometimes, especially when we're at the bottom of a black hole. But it's also why it takes courage to break out of those things. What or who helps you to remember to hope? For me, it's very simple things that I forget a lot. But one of them is practicing gratitude. It's intentionally forcing myself to look at my life, to look at the good things in my life, to try to retrain my brain to not always focus on the bad. The other thing that's really important for me is surrounding myself with optimists, which can sometimes be hard to find. But people like my wife, people like Matt. I don't know if you've ever talked to Matt. Matt is the most optimistic person you've ever met in your life, and it infuriates me. And it is the most helpful thing for me. There are so many times where we're having conversation, and I will just say something, and he's just like, wow, okay. That was dark. It's really helpful for me to hear that and remember, like, okay, like, let's take a step back from that. Who or what helps you to remember to hope? What produces a sense of hope in you? How can you be more intentional in bringing those things or people or experiences into your daily life and weekly life? Just how can you be more intentional in putting yourselves in situations where you're forced to be more hopeful or encouraged to be more hopeful? There's a lot that we could say about all of this, and we are just scratching the surface of it tonight. This is certainly not the only things to say about it. But I wanted to keep this short and simple. When we're willing to look for hope, it produces in us courage to act. It produces in us a courage to pursue shalom in the world through each and every situation. It produces in us a courage to incite love and reduce suffering and increase joy in whatever and wherever we happen to find ourselves. So when you find yourselves reacting in fear, what I hope that you will take away from tonight, which is why I tried to not make this very complicated or long, the only thing I want you to remember tonight, when you find yourself reacting in fear, keep these words close to your heart. Wait on hope to appear, and do not be afraid. Will you pray with me? God, there are so many of us that need a glimpse of hope to appear. I'm not good at waiting. I know some of my friends are. I know some of my friends have been waiting for a very long time. God, I pray that you would point us towards where you are, where you're trying to bring good into the world through whatever situation we're going through. Give us a little glimmer of hope that we can begin to wait on and look for. A little glimmer of hope that will begin to produce courage in us to push through the fear that comes from living in an imperfect world. God, we want to respond to you rather than reacting to fear. Teach us how to do that. Help us find ways to intentionally move toward hope. And God, I pray for me and my friends in this room tonight and everyone hearing my voice, that in those moments of fear that we will remember your words. Wait for hope to appear and do not be afraid. We love you, God. It's in your name we pray. Amen.